northern states that those people would be enslaved. So back to Juneteenth. So once the war was over, for the most part, and they had signed the peace treaties and had surrendered, it took a while for the people in the rest of the country, sort of the West and the Midwest and the West, to hear about it. So it didn't just stop automatically. There was no internet. There was even snail mail wasn't really going to get the information out. So it took a while to get the word out. The war is over, and that the people who were enslaved are now free, more or less. So the last place to hear the news was Galveston, Texas. And they got the news on June 19th, 1865. So that's Juneteenth, June 19th. So they shortened it and said Juneteenth. So that's the purpose of the holiday. It celebrates the last people who were enslaved got the information that they were free. Any questions about that? Okay.
What kind of freedom they have?
That's a good question.
They don't have freedom. They have separate bathrooms, separate transportation, separate school.
Well, the kind of freedom they had was somebody waved their hand and said that you're free. However, you were enslaved and totally beholden to the person who enslaved you. They had fed you, you had a place to stay. Where were you going to go? So, okay, you're free. Brother, you're free. So where you going to go? But you don't have any money, you don't have any resources. So in addition to saying that they were free, the General Order Number 3, which is what it was called, said that they could stay on the plantation, but they now had to be paid wages. Of course, there was always a question of how much is a wage, and what's a decent wage for somebody who was enslaved yesterday and free today. Then what are you going to pay them? You haven't been paying them before. That's a whole other discussion. We can do that at another time, because there were some serious issues around that. The next thing I'm talking about, again, what I'm calling African American Muslim liberation theology. It had to do with the Atlantic slave trade. We seem to forget sometimes that the Africans who were enslaved, many of them came from established kingdoms that were in Africa, whether it was Sokoto in the north or Songhai, the Solinke people, who had empires, who were warriors, had lands and beautiful cities, many of them. Sure, there were others who were small villages who were taken, but many of the people who came and were captive were Muslim. The estimate is that 30%, up to 30% of the people who were enslaved and came here were practicing Muslims. And there's some evidence that they still continue to practice various levels of al-Islam here in the United States. Let's see, basic facts. In Africa itself, the slave trade wasn't just the Atlantic slave trade. You also had the trans-Saharan slave trade. The slaves were transported across the Sahara Desert, the Indian Ocean slave trade, the Barbary slave trade, the slave markets in the Ottoman Empire in Tunisia and Tripoli, Tunisia again, Libya, Sudan, and some in Mauritania. But our focus today is basically on the transatlantic slave trade, where there was it's reported that there may have been as many as 12 million. That's a vast number. As many as 12 million people who were transported. That doesn't mean they all made it. People died, let's say if they were inland, maybe 100 miles or so, people died on the trek to the ocean along the way. People who were young or old, men, women, whoever died, they just left them there along the route to die. Muslim, many of them. Then when they came to the ports and were put in the castles, dungeons, however you want to call those. Many people died there, sometimes packed 40, 50 in a room, could barely breathe, in filth, no minimum amount of water, so people died there. Then the ones who were fortunate enough, if they stayed for maybe 3 months and survived, even to get on a ship for a 2 or 3 month journey across the Atlantic Ocean under the most horrid kinds of conditions again, many of them died. And the reports are that when people died, they just threw them overboard. They were sick, they threw them overboard. And some of the narratives talk about the sharks that used to follow the slave ship, the ships, the whole route, because they knew that at some point they were going to get fed by the bodies of the people who were enslaved. So what happens? Of course, when the people get here, they're put into shackles, put on the auction block, and sold. They call it chattel slavery. They were treated like pigs and dogs and hogs as part of property. And sometimes with chains on their necks, and braces, and things on their face. If people were escaping, they would sometimes chop off a foot. If anybody remembers those early television programs from Roots, you may remember some of the.
True story?
Say it again?
Was true story?
Yeah. The true story in terms of the way it's recorded in history, that people had their hands chopped off, their legs chopped off. If they were running away, they had some things that were so long braces on their neck, thin, so that it was bells on it, so that if the people kept trying to run away, they could hear them with the bells. With the bells on them, or either the thing was so large that if you moved around, people would say, he's escaping. So there were a number of people who did escape. There's the story of people who were called the Maroons. So some of the Muslims who, again, some of these were warriors. In their own countries, they have fought wars, either with cavalry or infantry, and they knew strategy, and they could write. Many times we hear people talk about the ignorant African who was here, who had no culture and could not write. There may have been some who could not write, but that wasn't true of the Muslims who could write the Arabic. Even if they didn't speak the language. And there are some documents that are in the archives here of Muslims who would write in the Arabic script. But if you read it, you're actually reading English. They didn't know how to write English. They knew how to write Arabic. So they would communicate and keep logs and journals in the Arabic. And if you read it, then they could say, okay, it's 24 of these or 60 of those. These are the cattle. This is what happened. So this, again, we're talking about the presence of the Muslims, African Muslims who were here in the United States. I'll just name a few of them. There's one who was called Ayub Suleiman Diallo, and he was a Fulani Muslim prince from West Africa who was kidnapped to Americas during the slave trade. And it's interesting because he was kidnapped as a person who previously owned slaves and who was selling slaves. He was selling slaves and was somewhere, and instead some people jumped him and took him, and he ended up being enslaved. His name was Ayub Suleiman Diallo. And he wrote a first-hand account, so we know him because he wrote down what had happened to him and how he was captured. We also know him because his portrait was painted and is in one of the museums. So if we need some physical evidence that there were Muslims here, he's in traditional dress, and there was a narrative about how he was captured, and some painter decided to paint his photograph. There's also a brother named Yado Mahmoud. He was formerly enslaved, became an entrepreneur, was noted for his own businessman. Became a businessman, purchased his freedom. Abdul Rahman Ibrahim Asori, again, another person. He was a nobleman. They used to call him Prince. Again, another Fulani. There were a couple of other people, Salah Bilali, who was born around 1790 in Messina, in northern Nigeria, in Mali, I'm sorry. And after being captured and sold along the Gold Coast in the transatlantic slave trade, he was first taken to the Bahamas, then made his way back to the States. Again, some of the empires that the Africans were taken from, the Kamnan Empire, the Songhai, Bornu, the Sultanate of Darfur, Futa Toro, and again another person, Omar Said, another full Islamic scholar from West Africa, who was transported to the United States in 1807. So I just wanted to talk about a few of these, of the what we call the pioneers, and then bring us forward to sort of the foundings of, or the rediscovery of Islam. There was a man named Noble Drew Ali. Noble Drew Ali was from North Carolina and decided to claim his Islamic heritage and started the Moorish Science Temple, Moorish Science Temple, here in Newark, New Jersey. And he influenced another person, you may have heard the name of the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, and the original Nation of Islam was influenced in part by the movement of the Moorish Science Temple. Some people have some issues with the Nation of Islam and the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. However, in his book called The Message to the Black Man, he basically told the black people in the United States, you are Muslim. You are Muslim, your ancestors are Muslim. You need to fall away from this foolishness of eating pork and drinking the alcohol and living these licentious lives. And you need to focus on Allah, the messenger. You need to say the prayer and establish it in this country. And we know, remember that out of him came the Al-Hajj Malik al-Shabazz, who some people call Malcolm X, and the tremendous impact he had on the African American community, as well as the son of the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, Imam Mu'addin, who brought the community, the African American Muslim community, more fully into what we would call Sunni Islam. And that organization still exists today.
You didn't mention Louis Farrakhan.
Certainly, he was next. The Honorable Louis Farrakhan. Some people seem to have some objection to him. However, we will not throw the baby out with the bathwater. That he has been consistently focused on the issue of the African American and the African American Muslim. This has been his whole focus. If people, white people, green people, purple people, if they disagree with him, that's on them, and that's between them and their Lord. As long as he stays focused on teaching how to be an honorable Muslim and keep us away from the dunya, keep us away from all kinds of evil, and keep us focused on the worship of Allah, we have to give him the credit that he used to. And the last person I wanted to talk about was Sheikh Abdul Latif Ali, who's my mentor, a good friend to this community, who returned to Allah several years ago. And he established the Admiral Family Circle Islamic Community, which continues the work of Al-Hajj Malik al-Shabazz, especially in the area of international human rights, and also in the area of dealing with the mental health and the building of self-determination, self-affirmation, and self-development of the African Americans. So that's about, it's a brief discussion. At some point if you have questions, we can handle some of those. And there may be other times to talk about other various aspects of the African American Muslim liberation theology. Assalamu alaikum. Thank you for your attention.
So we wanted to add on to that a little bit, and we wanted to talk about. Initially, we were not recording, so I just wanted to reiterate something that Dr. Muhammad Musa had mentioned, and then add on to that as well from something from my part, and that is that Islam prohibited slavery. It prohibited making a free person a slave, and unfortunately, we find that it wasn't always the case that Muslims practiced that. But with regard to those people that were already enslaved, Islam gradually worked towards their liberation by different techniques. One, by encouraging people to free slaves, by giving the opportunity of people that were enslaved to work for their own freedom, and also by setting people free when they were treated unjustly, when they were beaten oppressively, then they gained their freedom. And there were different techniques that were used in that regard. I want to say that it's very important for us to understand this history, because one of the things that we don't talk about when we talk about specifically slavery when it comes to the issue of the African American community, and African American means all the Africans in all of the Americas, not just the US, is that when Al-Andalus collapsed, at that time when Al-Andalus began to collapse, which was towards the end of the end phase of the Ottoman Empire, Al-Andalus wasn't the only place to feel the impact of colonization. This is something extremely important, because there's some lessons that we learn what happens when societies collapse. We saw this come up in the issue of Libya. We saw it come up in the issue of Syria. And we know that there were some groups that tried to say that they were reinstituting slavery over there in the name of Islam, and so on and so forth. And that even began a long conversation here in the US recently. There was a book that was published by Dr. Jonathan Brown. Whether we agree or disagree on that point, what he was writing, he was trying to argue that slavery wasn't just an issue that was associated with blackness, like it became associated later on. And that was the same argument that took place over 500 years ago with Imam Ahmed Baba. Imam Ahmed Baba was one of the leading scholars of Timbuktu. He was one of the top scholars of Timbuktu, actually. And he ended up being enslaved. And so he wrote a whole fatwa on the impermissibility of enslaving another Muslim. That was one. And then there was another scholar. His name was Nasr ad-Din. He was from Mauritania. I don't know what his last name was. But Nasr ad-Din, he went to the non-Muslims in Africa, because at that time there was war as the consequence of the collapse of Al-Andalus and in Mali and Timbuktu. All of that area was being affected as the colonial powers were rising, specifically Portugal and then Spain. It was creating chaos in the whole area. So Nasr ad-Din went to them and said, why did you kill all these people? He went to the non-Muslims. This is something that we have to talk about. How was that Islam began to influence this discussion on liberation and freedom and the ending of slavery? He said it's better to enslave them, not because he was pro-slavery, but because he was seeing that they were annihilating whole peoples. And then that discussion was furthered by people like Ahmed Baba, that you can't enslave a free person, that you can't enslave a Muslim. And then the issue came that as Portugal began to gain more and more power, they began to align with people that were corrupt. There was no doubt. And as they aligned with people that were corrupt, that's where you began to see that more and more now it became profitable to steal people and to ship them somewhere else so that they can work in the economy. So with the rise of capitalism, we begin to see this problem, right? We begin to see the problem of slavery. We see it now in today's time with the issue of human trafficking and the stealing of organs. And we know that that's the case with all these refugees. They get caught up a certain percentage when they go into certain countries. They become subject to that problem. Either they have to sell their kidney or even they're killed. This stuff still goes on today. But what happened in West Africa was that Timbuktu was heavily impacted, specifically Sheikh Uthman bin Fodi, rahmatullahi alayh, and his people. And they had a Khalifa. They had a Khalifa that was established in the time period, right along with the Ottoman Empire. And that Khalifa was impacted by war. And the Muslims began to fight one another. No matter what we want to say, the history proves that that's a fact. All of those people, as they're coming into the Americas, because you have all these ulama now that were caught up in the slave trade, they were taken prisoners. They're the ones that end up going into Brazil, they end up going into Cuba, they end up going into the Dominican Republic. And what do? This is an important point. They began to make alliances with the people that are there that are being impacted by colonialism. And when they start to do that, you have all these rebellions all over the place. And this stuff now, before, for a long time, it was not talked about. It was hard to find any history document. But now, for whatever reason, within the last 20 years or so, there's been a flood of documentation. What we have to realize is that as the Muslims align with the non-Muslims, they were not aligning to say, well, you are disbelievers and so on and so forth. They were aligning with the non-Muslims for the case of justice. As that began to happen, that's when the European powers, especially the Spanish crown and the Catholic Church, they began to say it's prohibited for Muslims to come into the Americas. And so that's at the same time that the Crusades are being launched in other places like Spain and so on and so forth. So that meant that the Jews and the Muslims that were being pushed out of Al-Andalus, they were going into Morocco or they were coming into the Americas. And so there was all kind of tests that were taking place to see whether the person ate pork, to see whether the person went to Juma, to see whether the person was taking on Jewish customs. And they were really making sure that Islam didn't exist in these parts. But eventually what came out of this, as Napoleon went into Egypt, as a matter of fact, they went into their horses and in Al-Azhar to proclaim the French dominance in Egypt. In Haiti, there was a revolution. And the revolution was an alliance between the Muslims and the non-Muslims for freedom of all peoples, but specifically African peoples. And so that shows that, what was happening is that as the Muslims were coming into these areas, they were regrouping, they were changing their thinking. The Muslims were changing their thinking. And they were aligning with the non-Muslims, and they were more focused on what is justice. All the way to the time where we get the example of what was being mentioned by Dr. Muhammad Hatim. North America is a late example. All of this is taking place in Latin America, is taking place. As matter of fact, in Brazil, the Muslims would escape into the mountains and they would set up their own communities, which were called the Maroon communities. So by the time you get to North America, there's this idea of liberation that everybody has in all of the Americas. But at the same time, there's not freedom. There's no freedom to be able to practice. And so this brings a really important discussion for us on a political level. Does Islam, like Sheikh Muhammad Musa was saying, that Islam prohibits slavery? So then the question becomes now that for all of the thinking that has been happening in the last 500 years, what is the role of freedom? What is the role of equality? What is the role of human beings? This is something which in our political thought in the Muslim world is still not clear. But in this part of the world, it became something that was extremely important, not because the Muslims were behind the scenes, no, but because the Muslims now were on this side suffering all of the problems. Is what I'm saying clear? يعني كان التطور يعني في قضية يعني كيف نتصور الحرية والعدالة. We began to look at that in a completely different way. So at the end of the day, by the time that we get to people like Malcolm X, is really how much, it really is an example of how much damage was done over a 500-year period with the collapse of Al-Andalus. And Al-Andalus probably would not have collapsed and would not have opened the door to West Africa being invaded and Timbuktu being also invaded, because those were two places where there was a lot of knowledge of the deen. Al-Andalus and Timbuktu were places where there was civilization. It wasn't just a talk of يعني كلام في العقيدة وفي الصلاة فقط. They were into biology, they were into astronomy, they were into chemistry, they were into mathematics. They were into architecture. They were into civilization. We know that. The Muslims removing themselves from civilization was because they were fighting in Al-Andalus each other. That was the reality. That's what we see even today. What opened the door for Al-Andalus collapsing and opening up the door for Muslims to be taken into slavery in West Africa and so on and so forth, and all of this, what happened in North America, was that reality. Because if the Muslims were able to maintain themselves, they would have never opened the door for the Crusades to happen. That was one. The second thing was that in reality, we have to examine what happened with the Ottoman Empire. I did a talk like this in Ohio some years back. But the Ottoman Empire in reality also choked out, didn't allow for the non-Muslims to develop themselves. Just the same way that we see in today's time, that the transference of technology and so on and so forth to the Muslim world is prohibited. The same thing was happening with the Ottoman Empire. So in reality, the lessons that we have to pause on is, how are we going to deal with other people? How are we going to deal with non-Muslims? How are we going to deal with differences of opinion? What do we say about justice? How do we deal with the issue of humanity and human dignity? And then these things are from the objectives of the deen. I don't even want to say the Sharia, but the deen as a whole. يعني حفظ العرض وقضية العدالة, and حفظ الإنسانية, all of these types of things. That's what really the lessons that we get. Islam in the beginning of the da'wah was focused on that. That's what transformed Jahiliyyah. What transformed Jahiliyyah was the reality that Islam was bringing the dignity of the human being, freedom. And so we, somewhere along the line, we deviated. If you look in the books of fiqh, they talk about يعني من شروط يعني صحة الإسلام الحرية. They say from the soundness of a person's Islam is that they're free. And then somewhere along the line, we get this justification of the issue of slavery and so on and so forth. So there's no doubt that what is in history or what was practiced by some Muslims is not necessarily what Islam called us to. But at the same time, when we look at the history of Islam, when there was slavery and when there was an elimination of slavery, and we look at the example of Izzuddin Abdul Salam and the Mamluks and so on and so forth, those people were integrated into the society. That didn't happen here. Right? That did not happen here. When they eliminated slavery, so to speak, they didn't give people reparations. They didn't give people a chance to integrate totally into society up to now. So that's why we're seeing all of these social problems that we see in the society. Right? And so what we have to think of as Muslims is, as our countries collapse, as we see all these social problems, how are we on the side of protecting human dignity? And we say that all the time in the khutbah and all of this type of stuff, but that's important, because once we eliminate the importance of human dignity, it opens the door for everything. It opens the door for any kind of oppression, economic oppression, political oppression, or even the possibility of slavery again. We see this problem in India right now. How can you have a whole community, you just eliminate their citizenship, right? Who's paying attention to the situation in India, right? Or when we look at the issue of the refugee population throughout the world, how they're just left on the ocean. You know what I'm saying? No human rights, no human dignity. So if we learn anything from all of this, is that what has to be at the forefront of our discourse as Muslims is this protection of human dignity. And that's from the deen. That's from the Sharia. It's from the deen. Once we eliminate this idea from our thinking and from our practice, the idea that Allah Ta'ala says, لَقَدْ كَرَّمْنَا بَنِي Adam, is not saying that, that he's only giving dignity to the Muslim, but Allah Ta'ala is saying, لَقَدْ كَرَّمْنَا بَنِي Adam, all of humanity. Once we eliminate that, there's no way for us to be able to move forward. What we're going to be doing from here on in is trying to see what country we can go to find economic freedom, to find dignity, and we'll never have it amongst ourselves, or we won't protect it. And we're in a dangerous place in this country right now. And not only in this country, as in Europe as well. And that's this idea of racism, this idea of not respecting the human being. One group is better than another group. And that's the problem that we saw in Al-Andalus. In Al-Andalus, the problem began with the issue of takfir, and it ended with the issue of destroying the whole of the society. So if we're going to say that Islam is against slavery and so on and so forth, we also have to talk about how Islam protects the human being and human dignity and calls for freedom and justice. If we don't have that in the way that we talk about Aqidah, or in other words, the way that we deal with the non-Muslims and the way that we talk about the non-Muslims and even those who choose not to be Muslim, if we don't protect their dignity as human beings, we won't protect our own dignity. I hope that that's clear, and with that we end. I don't know if Sheikh Musa has anything to add.
لا الحمد لله جزاك الله خيرا. يعني الحمد لله الشيخ يوسف والدكتور محمد حاتم يعني غطوا الموضوع كويس، فأدعو الله سبحانه وتعالى أن يجعله في موازينهم إن شاء الله. In the end, inshallah, just to thank Dr. Hatim for his coming and for his lecture. Get a lot of information from him. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless him and reward him inshallah. والشيخ يوسف جزاه الله خيرا. وإن شاء الله يعني we'll invite إن شاء الله دكتور محمد حاتم the next time to continue إن شاء الله second part. جزاه الله خيرا وأدعو الله سبحانه وتعالى أن يتقبل منه إن شاء الله. بارك الله فيكم وجزاكم الله خيرا. عندكم أي أسئلة؟ عندك سؤال؟ بارك الله فيك. طيب إذا ما عندكوش أسئلة شكلكم كده ممكن تنزلوا تاخدوا قهوة من تحت عشان تعرفوا تصلوا العشاء 4 ركعات.